And I have to confess, when I sent this title, I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to be talking about. But the title does sum up my main research interests right now, to understand more about how we are able to cooperate across different types of divides and what stops us. And what I decided in the end is I was going to focus on work I've been doing into cooperation across and conflict across religious boundaries. But before I talk about some of the work that I've been doing recently, and a lot of this is new data, unpublished, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with everyone here, I thought I would situate it within some of the broader questions that I've been asking myself as part of this program of work. So a few years ago, there was this editorial published in Science by the editor of Science, arguing that if we're going to solve the climate crisis, we need to first achieve peace. And he wrote that if we want a positive energy future for a healthier climate, the West must start by recasting foreign policy with climate and energy issues at the forefront. And that can only succeed if nations strengthen their commitment to settle differences with diplomacy and not war. And notwithstanding what I felt was a strange preoccupation of the West here, I think it's obviously broader than that. It's difficult to disagree with the basic idea. We're all solving a collective crisis. We're all facing a collective crisis here, I'm sorry. And if we're going to solve it, we have to find a way to act collaboratively, to cooperate with each other, to cooperate across, for example, national divides. And it's true not just for the climate crisis, that's the existential crisis we're facing, for many other crises, for how we are going to try and deal effectively, humanely, with the desire and right of humans to move around the globe to seek asylum, something that we're also failing at. If we're going to deal effectively with the next pandemic, again, collectively, something that we failed with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in some ways it's obviously true, but there's also something that's lacking here, right? It's not a simple matter of a commitment and willpower. We need a better understanding of what drives us into conflict and what helps us to find ways to cooperate. This is a question I think many of us are asking ourselves here. And when we think about why we're failing, I think an answer that many people automatically reach for is this. And it's true. Humans are parochial and we're violent. Of course, we're not the only violent species. Many other primates and many other species engage in intergroup violence and conflict. But what makes us unique is that we form groups based on ideas, fictions, and we're willing to kill and die for those fictions. So here we have Abraham willing to sacrifice his son to demonstrate his commitment to his idea of a God. And so it's true, we are parochial and we're violent, but there's also this other part, this other essential characteristic of humans that is equally defining. We have an exceptional ability and tendency to cooperate across group boundaries. In fact, we do so more than any other primate. We trade goods, we trade ideas across group boundaries, and that's key to human flourishing and a key aspect of human existence as well. A few years ago in Science, there was this article published, and this figure shows perforated shells that were discovered connected to a human population that existed over 100,000 years ago. And these shells are interesting for two reasons. First, they show signs of symbolic culture. People collected these shells and probably used them for decorative purposes. But another interesting feature is that they were discovered over 40 kilometers from what would have been the contemporary coastline. So we can ask ourselves how the shells got there. most likely they got there through some type of long-distance trading system. And there's earlier evidence of long-distance trade among humans. So this ability is also central. And so we have a paradox. We have these two aspects of humans that we need to understand. And I think that in order to better solve our collective problems, we need to understand how this paradox plays itself out, right? When people cooperate and when people engage in conflict. And again, I think this is a question that many of us here are asking. And so that being said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing into one specific type of human divide. A while ago I started this, a few years ago I started this research investigating cooperation and conflict across religious divides and between religious groups. And I remember I was on my way to my first piece of fieldwork in Fiji, and I stopped by Australia along the way, and I had a conversation, a dinner party with some old friends and family, very smart, educated people, and they were poking a little bit of fun at me. I got funding to go to Fiji to do research. What exactly are you doing research on? And I told them the question. And then they thought I was even crazier because the answer to them was obvious. Religion is a cause of human conflict. And indeed, there is a long-held belief in this correlation between religion and human conflict. And this belief that religion causes conflict and that specific religious beliefs are associated with conflict has, I think, really important policy implications. Part of the reason that Donald Trump was elected president is his stated policy to prevent more Muslim immigration into the United States. And here he wasn't leading popular opinion, but actually following it. Right? Prior to him actually running for the presidency, a large proportion of Americans agreed with the notion of stopping or preventing further Muslim immigration into the United States. And of course, the United States isn't alone here. And in general, I think there is a certain, if we want to look for examples of religious conflict, it's not difficult to find it. Also, at the start of this research program, I gave a talk in Isreal at the Hebrew University, and I also stated the question, and one faculty member put their hand up and said the Crusades, as though that was the end. And many people argue that the very existence of God, or a notion of God itself, is a cause of human conflict. So a year and a half ago, Shalom Auslander wrote this opinion piece in the New York Times during the Jewish festival of Passover, where he proposed that we pass over God. And he wrote that perhaps now, as missiles rain down and the dead are discovered in mass graves, it's a good time to stop emulating this hateful God. Perhaps we can stop extolling his brutality, and perhaps now is a good time to teach our children to pass over God, to be as unlike him as possible. And again, I think this notion that religious belief, and particularly a belief in a God or gods, is a source of human conflict is really widespread. Public intellectuals like Sam Harris and Steve Pinker share this idea, and of course Richard Dawkins, who I think once described God as a mean and vindictive ethnic cleanser. And it's not simply public intellectuals who argue this. Some scholars coming from more nuanced theoretical positions have argued that religion can be a source of conflict. Someone called Scott Atran, for example, and Jeremy Ginges wrote a few years ago that religion, in promoting outlandish beliefs and costly rituals, increases in-group trust, but might also increase mistrust and conflict with outgroups. And so here the idea is that religion is a pretty useful system for galvanizing strong pro-sociality within a group. And if that is part of the key function of religion, perhaps that leads to conflict with other groups too. And similarly, Aranoran Zion and colleagues argued in a really influential paper connecting the belief in what Noran Zion calls big gods, all-knowing, all-powerful gods that care about and police the moral behavior of humans, and that produce pro-social religions, where people are strongly pro-social within a religious group, argued that the solidarity-building potential of pro-social religions or of big gods can turn toxic for people who are seen to fall outside of the imagined moral boundaries, such as perceived religious outgroups. So I think this is a really common and broadly accepted hypothesis or argument that beliefs in God can encourage conflict between people who have different conceptions of the nature of God, or who perhaps don't believe in God at all. It's a significant cause of conflict. And this is what most of my friends and family thought, and this is what the faculty members at the Hebrew University believed as well. But no research is possible without an alternative hypothesis, which I'll discuss now. So one reason for an alternative hypothesis is that although we can think of a lot of examples of conflict along religious lines, we can also think of examples of cooperation between religious groups. And we can also think of religious norms, such as the Golden Rule or rules about hospitality towards strangers, that we could imagine or suppose might promote cooperation. And so that's one reason to suppose an alternative hypothesis, or to propose one, that belief in gods might encourage intergroup cooperation in some contexts. And another reason to propose this hypothesis, I think, is this paradoxical nature of humans. So we know that we're parochial, but we also know that we have a unique ability to cooperate across group boundaries. And so we might ask, where does that ability come from? And probably it comes from different types of cultural institutions or fictions that we've created. And it seemed to me perhaps unlikely that a belief in God could be so dominant and so broadly diffused among humans if it invariably promoted intergroup conflict. So together with a few others, I developed a cross-cultural research program to investigate this question and to try and discriminate between these two different hypotheses. And we've been carrying out studies with diverse religious groups, mainly Christians and Muslims, also Jews and Hindus, in a number of different religious sites. I'm going to talk about our three main sites now. The first is an exotic, curious place that we've been working in called the United States. Here we've been focusing mainly on conflict between Christians and Muslims, which really amounts to a study of prejudice that particularly white Christians have towards Muslims. So you're all familiar with this level of conflict. It's quite similar to levels of conflict between religious conflict in Europe and the United Kingdom as well. Our second religious site was Palestine and Israel, the Middle East, and I think we're all aware here that this is a site of extreme, chronic, violent conflict between Jewish Israelis and predominantly Muslim Palestinians. And our third site, again, was Fiji. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about Fiji before I talk about some of the data, because I'm guessing that most people, when they think about Fiji, think about an image like this. And it's true, Fiji is a beautiful place and sometimes a pleasant place to do research. But it's also a fascinating place if you're interested in intergroup relations. And I think it's an important place to study intergroup relations. So Fiji is made up predominantly of Christian Italke, indigenous Fijians, who make up now about 57% of the population. And the rest of the population predominantly are Indo-Fijians, Indians who were brought over primarily by British colonialists as indentured servants to work for them. About 75% of Indo-Fijians are Hindu, around 20% are Muslim. And at the time of Fijian independence from Great Britain in 1970, the populations were pretty evenly matched, actually. About 51% of the population were Italke and 49% were Indo-Fijian. And the two groups got along reasonably well until in 1987, a government was elected with an Indo-Fijian at its head. And this started this prompted 2 military coups. And there was that were violent, and there was an even more violent one in 2000, again, after an election of a government headed by an Indo-Fijian. There were mass violent protests. Indo-Fijians were expelled, often from their lands and homes, and made internal refugees. And many have emigrated. So in 1970, about 49% of the population were Indo-Fijian. The last time anyone ran a census in 2007, it was down to about 37%. And I'm discussing these coups to demonstrate that it's not that it is an important place to study intergroup conflict and intergroup relations, but I don't want to make it seem that the Indo-Fijians were the only victims. Both groups have been victims of settler colonialism, and both have suffered immensely. Okay, so we have these 3 different research sites that differ along in multiple ways: linguistically, geographically, politically. But the main way that they differed from perspective of what we were interested in was the level of violence and the level of conflict. Most Christian and Muslim Americans think of themselves as belonging to the same group, a superordinate group of, a citizen of the United States. Of course, Jewish Israelis and Muslim Palestinians do not think of themselves as belonging to the same group, superordinate group. And the same is true, and in Fiji it's a little bit more complex. Indo-Fijians think of themselves as true Fijians. Italke do not consider Indo-Fijians to be truly Fijian. So you can see the title's a bit cut off here. But I'm going to talk about 2 experiments that we've run. The first one has been published quite recently. The second one has not been published. And what I want to do is talk about the way in which these experiments have forced all of our team at one stage have to update some of our ideas about this issue. So the first behavioural experiment that I'm going to talk about is an experiment measuring generosity. And we ran this experiment in these 3 different research sites in Fiji, the US, Israel, and the West Bank. And some of the experiments were run online in the US and in Israel. And in Fiji and the West Bank, we ran the experiments as part of field experiments. And the experiment that I'm going to talk about is quite simple and straightforward, but I wanted to just mention that particularly in our field sites, they were embedded within a month-long research process, right, where a lot of the work and a lot of the studies were co-created with our local team. And so I'm going to talk about 8 studies in total, 8 particular replications of the same study with over 5,000 people. With almost 5,000 people. And we ran here a version of the dictator game. And I'll explain the way the game worked in the field. So in the field, participants were given a large envelope in private. And inside the envelope were a number of coins and 2 smaller envelopes. One which said, mine, the other one said, give to another person. And participants could distribute in private these coins however they wished. In between these 2 envelopes, they could take all the money and give none to the other person, or they could, at the other end of the spectrum, divide the coins evenly. And they played this game a number of times, each time with a different person. And participants always were told that the other person lives in a different part of the country, I should say, in all of the experimental conditions. So it was never going to be someone who they knew or who they were related to. And they were also told that the decision, it would all be anonymous. The person who received the money, if they gave them money, would never know the identity of the giver. And they, of course, did not know the identity of the person they were giving money to. So participants participated in a number of different games, trials of this, always interacting with another person, but that person was always a member of their own ethno-religious group or another one. So, for example, a Muslim Indo-Fijian would interact with either another Muslim Indo-Fijian all the time or a Christian Italke. And the first time they played the game, they were just simply told the rules and people made the decisions however they saw fit. The second time, before making their decision, they were asked to think about what God would want them to do. And our research team was were mixed in our expectations about what would happen here. We all had different prior expectations. Everyone agreed that everyone thought that when people interacting with a member of their own ethno-religious group, when they thought about God, they'd probably be more generous. Right? So there was broad agreement there. But there was a real disagreement about what would happen when they interacted with a member of the outgroup, particularly in a place like Palestine or Israel. Some people thought thinking about God would lead our participants to give less money to members of the religious outgroup. Some people thought God would just be irrelevant to this question. There would be no change. And others thought that this extra generosity that people often feel when thinking about God, or often display when interacting with a member of their own group, would be extended to a member of the religious outgroup. And I'm sure all of you have your own prior beliefs about what might happen here. And so the dependent variable was the percentage of money that participants gave away. So these are results in the trials where participants were not asked to think about God. So this is what happened at baseline. And you can see the blue bars show people who were interacting with ethno-religious outgroups, and the white bars show the in-group. And yeah. So you can see here the overall results across the different contexts. People showed an in-group bias, right? They gave more money to a member of the ethno-religious in-group than an out-group. And we expected that. As social psychologists, we know that you can put people into imaginary groups and people will show this type of bias. But it is quite interesting to look at how the bias differed across contexts. As you can see, it was greatest in the Middle East. Again, may not be too surprising given the context. But the real question is, what would happen when people thought about God? Would there be no change? So this shows a 0% change, positive change or negative change, and how would that differ depending on who our participants were interacting with? All right, so this shows the overall result. And you can see that participants gave more money when thinking about God, and it didn't depend on who they were interacting with. So they gave 4% of the stake, more of the stake, which amounts to an 11% increase in what they gave at baseline. And again, they gave this extended equally to members of the religious ingroup and religious outgroup. How did this differ across contexts? Well, you can see that it was quite noisy, and there's a lot to take in here. But I'll summarize it by saying that in 7 out of the 8 cases, our participants gave more money to the ethno-religious outgroup when thinking about God. Right, the only case that didn't happen was with Jewish Israelis, who trended in that direction, but it wasn't a reliable increase. And in no case did people give more money to the ethno-religious in-group and not also extend that added generosity to the out-group. Okay. So a take-home message from this first study was that people at least believe that their God wants them to be more generous to members of ethno-religious outgroups, even in contexts of high conflict. But what I'm really interested in is cooperation. And I'll tell you something about my own beliefs here. I predicted this result based on some prior work that I'd been doing, not because I was particularly innovative in my ideas, perhaps just based on some preliminary results. But I thought that thinking about God might actually disrupt intergroup cooperation. And the reason is that in order to cooperate, we need to trust. So my prediction was that people would think that their own God promoted cooperation and generosity and benevolence, but that other God, that other conception of God held by the outgroup would not. Right? The other's God would promote aggression and conflict. And that's where I thought that cooperation might break down. And this was based on a lot of social psychological work and also some cognitive anthropological work that, again, Scott has been involved in, showing that even when people hold the same values, hold similar norms, conflict can, and indeed want to cooperate, conflict can result from people having misperceptions about the outgroup. And typically, those misperceptions are negative. And this is found really quite consistently in different domains. And it seemed to me that religion, particularly in places of ethno-religious conflict, would be a good candidate for this type of misperception. So that was my prediction. I have to confess, written the paper in my head, right? But we had to test it, and to test it, we ran a trust game, or a series of trust games. So the game involves 2 players, player A and player B. And player A is given a stake, in this case $5, right? And they're told that they're interacting with another person, and again, the identity is always, they're anonymous, they will never meet the other person will never meet them, they won't know each other's identity. And they were told you can give however much of this stake that you want to the other player, player B. And whatever player B gets, we will triple. So if you give player B $5, we're going to turn it into $15, right? And player B is going to be given the option of returning some money to you. Okay, sometimes this is called an investment game, and you can see why. If you fully trust player B, what makes sense is for you to give all of your money to player B, thinking that they will probably be nice and split the pot, they'll reciprocate, and you'll end up with 50% more money, and both of you will be well off. So there are 2 reasons why you may not want to invest money in player B. One is that you just don't like them, and you just don't want this mutually cooperative, beneficial outcome with them. Another reason is that you just don't trust them, okay? And so you may just decide, I'll keep my $5 and, whatever. And in our experiments, we had a couple of different manipulations. Again, we manipulated whether participants were playing a member of their own ethno-religious group or a member of the other ethno-religious group. And in some trials, we ask player B to think about God before making their return choice. And all players know about the instructions given to the other player. So when player A is playing a player B who is asked to think about God, player A knows that, right? And they can factor that in to their choices. So what happens? And again, most of us believed that when participants were playing a member of their own ethno-religious group, we all agreed, I think, we thought that knowing that the other member was thinking about God would increase trust and they'd invest more money. But at least I thought when people were playing a member of the other ethno-religious group, you would see a decrease in trust. So what happened? So again, that's the design. Players were from the same or different ethno-religious group, and they all played the game twice, always with a member of either the same or the different group. And again, in the second time, we asked player B to think about God as they understood God to be when deciding how much to reciprocate. Okay, so the key interest here is what happens with player A? What will player A predict about player B, and how will that influence their choices? And to put the thumb on the scale a little bit in favour of my hypothesis, the first study was run in Israel between Muslim Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish Israelis. And we ran this study in late 2021, months after major civil violence. Right? So in the summer of 2021, in response to forced evictions of Muslim Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem, there was conflict between Hamas and Israel, violent conflict, and that extended to Israel proper. So Jewish Israelis and Christian and Muslim Palestinians were engaged in street violence, including attempted lynchings. Okay. So this is the context. And we had almost 600 participants here, more or less evenly split between Jewish Israelis and Muslim Palestinians. This study was run online due to COVID. Okay, I'll tell you the results. So I'm most interested here in the results for player A, but of course I'll tell you about what player B did as well. And the effects were almost the same for Jewish Israelis and Muslim Palestinian citizens of Israel. So here the effects are just collapsed, averaged across both groups. So this shows what they did at baseline, how much money they invested, the percentage of money that they sent to player B. And you can see again, there's an in-group bias here. People trusted their own group more than they trusted the other group. So what happens when they're asked to think about God? Well, it turns out I was wrong, right? People give more money, they invested more, even when they're dealing with a member of the religious outgroup. So a Jewish Israeli invested more in a Muslim Palestinian when they knew that the Muslim Palestinian was being asked to think about Allah, and this result shocked me, I have to say. And their faith was rewarded. In general, participants gave more money, returned more money, they reciprocated more when thinking about their God. And okay, if you have any questions, I'll leave further comments to those. So, making belief in God salient facilitated cooperation between Jewish Israelis and Muslim Palestinians. And we have replicated these findings in two other experiments between Christians and Muslims in the United States, and in a field study in Fiji with Christian Italke and Indo-Fijians when they were playing not for themselves but for their community. So whatever money they got would actually go to their own congregation. So here is my running, working conclusion here that might be interesting to talk about. Across religious boundaries, belief in gods, even different gods, appears to signal a commitment to a set of common universal values, fostering cooperation, at least in economic contexts. And I think the remarkable thing to me about these findings is that they show how sensitive and nuanced people are in making cooperative decisions or non-cooperative decisions in intergroup contexts. People seem to have a really fine-grained idea about what differences matter when. And this brought to mind for me a quote by, or a piece of writing by Camus, who argued that people are not all alike. I'm well aware of the deep differences of tradition that separate me from an African or a Muslim, but I also know what unites me to them. And I do not want to suggest for a second that religion invariably promotes cooperation. There are obviously contexts in which it can promote conflict, and understanding that difference is one of the projects that I'm working on right now. But at least when we're dealing with economic contexts, the results of these studies suggest that cooperation across different types of boundaries might actually be facilitated by religious belief and belief in God in particular, even when those beliefs are significantly different.